I'm a professor of global security and technology at Leiden University in the Netherlands, and I'm a senior fellow of the Hague program for cyber norms, which is the organization that is organizing this debate. Welcome to the panel, Rethinking Cyber Espionage After the Solar Hack. We'll be talking about, after the SolarWinds hack, we'll be talking about SolarWinds. We're talking about the Microsoft Exchange hack. We'll talk about those, but we'll talk about mostly in relation to cyber espionage in a broader sense. So how do we talk about cyber espionage? How do we deal with cyber espionage, or how do we not deal with cyber espionage? One of the reasons we want to do this because cyber espionage seems often caught between very fierce reactions of targets, both by companies and by governments. I don't know if your Twitter feed looks anything like mine today at this moment, but there's a lot of things coming in about the reactions of the Biden administration to SolarWinds and a whole host of other things that happened in and outside of cyberspace. That's one element of it, the fierce reactions. On the other hand, there's always the reaction also from national security, from the intelligence community itself, almost matter-of-factly saying, this is what states do. This is normal business of states, nothing to see here, move along. And then we move along and then we come to the next incident and then we repeat to a large extent. But I think there is questions to be asked about cyber espionage. There's some aspects of cyber espionage that are perhaps different or different enough to merit a discussion about, okay, does it compare to classic espionage in a one-on-one way? And so the consensus of not talking about about espionage may not be the best fit with cyber espionage. For example, there's a very fine line between gaining access for cyber espionage and gaining access for doing very different things, more active operations, preparing the battlefield, sabotage, or even a full-fledged cyber attack. It's often very hard to know at the beginning of an operation, but also it's often very hard to know whether when an operation continues, the goalpost may not change during this. And that has consequences for risk perception, has consequences for what we think about escalation and de-escalation. Another point is the indiscriminate access that sometimes comes with cyber espionage. SolarWinds and the Microsoft Exchange are also examples of that. It leaves backdoors open sometimes, it leaves vulnerabilities open, and that creates vulnerabilities not just for the intended targets, but also for a much wider population, companies and end users. Much of the zone of operations for cyber espionage is also much broader than classic espionage. It's not just ministries, it's not just the military, it's not just the embassy. It's often use of commercial software that everybody uses. And I heard representatives of Microsoft say at some point, okay, if two state actors are in a conflict with each other, for us, it looks like two of our clients wreaking havoc on our network. That does something too, slightly different. And then with a question mark, the increase in activity. So we see more of it quantitatively, qualitatively. Maybe it is starting to differ. And what does that mean? And also, what does it mean if there is no form of efficient pushback against these kind of operations? What does that mean? How will it develop if there's nothing like that? And if we do think there should be pushback, what does that look like? Well, today we have a nice case study with what is going on in the United States. Is that efficient pushback? I think that's something we'll talk about. And lastly, the relationship, for example, between cyber defense in a broad sense. So how do you protect your society, your critical infrastructure, etc., and cyber espionage as a tool of national security? How do you balance these two major issues for any government? Both are to a certain extent needed, but how do you find the balance between these? So these are some of the questions that we hope to discuss today with our panel and with you in the audience. From earlier iterations of debates like this, we usually have a very good audience that is very interested and has good questions. So I would invite you all to put your questions into the chat. So I will be able to pick them up there and to put them to our panelists. If you want a specific panelist to speak to your question, please indicate so in the chat. That makes it easier for us to find it. I would aim to have first a discussion about amongst the panelists themselves, 45 minutes, maybe an hour, and then open it up to questions. And we'll go on till 5:30 or before we close, before, if we think, okay, we have said what we need to say on this issue. About the panel, when we put the panel together originally, we had a very nice 50-50 gender division. Unfortunately, that did not stay like that. So first we lost Liga Rosenthaler of Microsoft because she pulled back from the debate, and also pulled back as Microsoft from the debate. So that is in itself interesting. Apparently Microsoft at this moment in time does not wish to speak out on this issue, or at least not in this forum. Interesting, but we lost Liga, which is a big shame because she would have a very interesting perspective on this. Second, and I'm looking at my signal to see where we are, but no, I think to a large extent, we have also lost Nakashima to current events. Like I said, at the moment, Washington, D.C. is in an uproar over what is coming out of the Biden administration in terms of reaction to SolarWinds and different kind of operations. So there's a lot of work to do there, which is a shame. I hope she will be able to join us later in the debate. She has said she would try to do so, but for now, we're going to have to make do without her. So we hope for a contribution from Ellen, but we do have an excellent panel for you that is rearing to go and is here with us online. So let me introduce them shortly to you. Starting with Ronald Prins, with the SolarWinds waving behind him. Ronald is co-founder of Hunt Hackett, which is a new cybersecurity company here in The Hague. I think you're based. I'm quoting something from the website because I think it's good for this debate. So, we are first and foremost experts in cybersecurity, safeguarding European companies against cyber threats and espionage. Our specialists operate on the front lines of cyber conflicts and help our customers prevent, detect, and respond to today's most advanced adversaries. So very much in the private domain, trying to fight off high-end adversaries, including espionage. He's also a former member of one of the oversight boards of the national intelligence agencies in the Netherlands. And to most people, he is probably best known as the founder and CEO of Fox IT, which is a leading company for cybersecurity in the Netherlands and the European Union. Next up, we have Ciaran Martin, waving now. Ciaran is a professor of practice in the management of public organizations at the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford University. Prior to joining the school, Ciaran was the founding chief executive of the National Cybersecurity Center, which is a part of GCHQ, which is a part of the intelligence community. And the NCSC's approach has been lauded internationally for responding quickly to incidents and giving the British public clear and prompt advice on responding to them. Also by putting previously classified information in the hands of industry so that companies can defend themselves more effectively. But interestingly, of course, being a part of GCHQ, it has both this overall cybersecurity defense component as it has the national security espionage component, not necessarily within the NCSC, but within GCHQ. So that's interesting. Lastly, but not least, we have Russell Buchan joining us from Sheffield. Russell is a senior lecturer in international law at the University of Sheffield, working and publishing on the intersection of international law and cybersecurity. And fairly recently, in 2018, he authored a book called Cyberespionage in International Law. So he's done a lot of work on the exact intersection of international law and espionage. That is our panel for us today. I'm really happy that you've all been able to join us. What I would roughly want to cover in the first part of the discussion is 3 themes. So what is SolarWinds? Let's start with the basics. What is the state of play with advanced cyber espionage? What have been the initial policy reactions? What is the debate that is currently unfolding, basically? And third, what are our options if we like to think more about state reactions? And so what are our options internationally, domestically, what can we do? I've already said this to the panelists in the previous, but please indicate if you want to speak. Also, if the question was not addressed to you, don't be shy and just speak out when you want to speak out on a certain issue. I always want to speak out to other people's questions as well. So let's start at the very beginning. Ronald, perhaps you could give us sort of like a short description of what the SolarWinds operation and the Microsoft Exchange hacks were, sort of in technical terms, and why they elicited such a strong response. So why are we all worked up about these two operations? Ronald.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Also, thank you for the very nice introduction you gave to me. Yeah, well, first about SolarWinds. Well, SolarWinds actually is not the hack. SolarWinds is a respectable American company, and they're building software for managing networks, and they're doing quite well because, they said themselves that 425 of the Fortune 500 companies are actually customers of them. And not only companies, but also a lot of federal agencies are actually using their software to managing networks. Yes, well, it's a pity indeed that Microsoft is not here, because they claimed actually that this attack was the largest and most sophisticated attack ever seen. While largest, I would agree, sophisticated. I've also seen the work of GCHQ, so welcome here, Ciaran. And they're also very, very, very well sophisticated. And I think the best attacks are actually the attacks you never see. And this is also very interesting. This is an attack which was really broad. It hit a lot of organizations. It probably started around March 2020 already and was only detected in December 2020. So I think it's very upsetting. It was unnoticed for just such a long time if it had this broad scope of organizations which were victim. Well, and the total amount of victims will be something like 18,000. Yeah, and what was actually hacked into? Where was it seen that the SolarWinds attack was being used? It was within a number of US departments. And first of all, actually, FireEye, a cybersecurity company itself, it was hit through this hack, and said they were actually the first one to notice. And this is also something, yeah, I think US agencies should a little bit be ashamed of, that they were not able to detect this themselves. But among DHS and Treasury, also the NATO, a number of EU organizations, even UK GCHQ, and the UK Ministry of Defense, and also, last but not least in my list here is AstraZeneca was also hit by this. What did the hackers actually do? Well, if you want to hack a lot of organizations, it takes a lot of time for each and every organization to find out how do I get insight in this network. So what they're doing these days, which is becoming more and more popular actually, is what we now call the supply chain attacks. So what they actually do is they go into a supplier of software. In this case, it's a SolarWinds. They're totally not interested in the company SolarWinds itself. What they do is they break into the SolarWinds backend system where the source code is. They try to manipulate the software they supply to their customers, and they make sure that in the next update, as we know, we always need to update our software because of security risks. For the next update, they have implanted their own little malware, which back connected to home, and probably this time to Russia. And this is a very clever trick. So people download these updates, they install it locally and a network. So for instance, these US departments, they will actually connect from inside this department back to what we call the command and control server. And from that point on, the hackers are able to take over the networks. And what's interesting is here, because they used the network software, the managing of the network software, which usually have a lot of administrative rights within an organization. They also automatically had all the rights which usually administrators have within an organization. Well, about the attackers, it's very probably it's Russians. That is why Biden has signed his executive order this morning on the response. Probably it's APT 29. We also know them as Cozy Beer. which is the hacking group, which is part of the Russian Foreign Intelligence Services, SVR, so it's the same organization like CIA or MI6, but in this case from Russia. And their goal is actually just to steal information relevant for the Kremlin administration. So it has nothing to do with disrupting anything in a network. They're only after information. I think and the response. I think we keep the response part for the later for the discussion later on. I think this basically sets the scene. It was a very large operation and also sophisticated, but at the end it was detected.
Thank you. That's good. So we have sort of a base to start from. What is interesting, you said, okay, this is SVR, it's APT29. So what we expect them to do is to find political information. It's normal collection of political espionage, basically. No disrupting is possible here. But I've also seen a number of comments around where people say, well, yes, but once you're in, there is no real way of telling what will happen next. So it's possible to sort of change course once you're in and use the foothold that you have for different purposes. So maybe I can ask Ciaran for a comment on this, because so how tailored or discriminated was this action? How sure are we that this is not a disruptive action, but is pure espionage? Because you hear different things. For example, the Biden administration has been using words like reckless and indiscriminate, and is focusing on the scope of the operation as something that is really they take offense of. But other people, other analysts, for example, Dmitry Alperovitch and Ian Ward say, basically, and Ronald Prins say, no, it's very highly targeted, basically. So it's a big spread. But so what are we talking about here? How would you see it?
Well, I'm just looking. Given that the executive order on the Biden administration response is just out, I'm looking carefully, and I caveat this with there's not been a lot of time to digest it, but I think what it does reflect, I mean, we will come on to the response at the moment, but in terms of what this is and how can we be sure, this statement is quite measured in terms of its description of what we can loosely call the SolarWinds hack is. It's talking the harmful foreign activities of the Russian government. It isn't, I can't find, I mean, I can do a Control F and see if the word reckless appears in it, but the word reckless is not present by my search. And I think that reflects, whilst there's been a lot of very heated language about it, very little of it has come from the Biden administration itself, certainly on the record. I think there is a recognition that this is, a very inopportune and damaging incident for the US, but at the same time, it has not used the language of some in Congress, for example, about act of war and so on. So I would concur and would not seek to repeat Ronald's excellent overview of what the operation is. I think there are two further points I could make. One, how can we be sure it's just espionage? Well, if you go beyond, I mean, we will never be able to be sure in perpetuity, because if you go beyond espionage, then you are talking about something that is probably going to be visible. Espionage can be invisible and is invisible until it's caught. But let's contrast this with the 2016 operation against the US presidential election of that year. So, of course, it was done, it is believed, by the FSB, so not the Foreign Intelligence Service, the SVR. But if you look at the two phases of that operation, so phase one was the extraction of information, spying, espionage. So they hacked the DNC, the Democratic National Committee server, and extracted information from it. They hacked the Gmail of an aide to Secretary Clinton and extracted information from it. Now, in that respect, given that at the time Secretary Clinton was widely assumed to be the strong favorite to become the next president of the United States, I think most people would have expected, I'm not making a moral judgment here, most people would have expected the Russian state to be trying to spy on her campaign. I don't think that would have come to any surprise. What is then surprising, and to many people a violation of international acceptable standards of conduct, is they did a massive data dump with what seems to have been the express intention of destabilizing America's election. And that was unusual. Now, let's fast forward to SolarWinds. The first of the two things I would say is that one can assume they have extracted information from the selected targets, and they can exploit that information. If any of it's embarrassing or politically contentious, they could do a data dump, as they did in 2016. But so far, it is patently obvious they have chosen not to do so, because otherwise we'd have noticed. They could have an access that they could exploit for disruptive purposes, but we'd notice that, and they haven't done that. So we can never be sure that they, and of course they've now lost that access, we're told to believe. So you can never be sure they will not use this for purposes beyond espionage. But as far as I can tell, as far as anybody can tell, outside of the US government, they have confined themselves to just espionage. So that's the first thing. The second thing is just to augment rather than contradict or contest what Ronald said. How reckless, indiscriminate, and so forth. Well, that kind of depends on what your view is on global on digital espionage. Our colleague from Microsoft isn't here, unfortunately, as you said, Dennis. But if she were here, Microsoft have put out around the time of the discovery of the operation, put out a blog which is consistent with a long-held company view that of two things. One is there's a need for some sort of digital Geneva Convention, which they've said for a long time. What they said in SolarWinds, which was new, was that this sort of contamination of the supply chain is itself stretching international norms. Now, I think there is a more strongly held view amongst Western governments, Five Eyes governments in particular, across large swathes of the cybersecurity industry, that actually, if you take that line, then quite a large amount of Five Eyes and indeed Western European digital espionage would fall foul of the same approach. So to give you a very personal example, I joined the board of GCHQ in late 2013, early 2014, just after the Snowden leaks. We were getting all sorts of court challenges about the legality of that, the operations allegedly exposed by those leaks. I signed court papers in 2015, which said, here's how digital espionage works. You have to cast the net very wide. That can be through the unwitting complicity of a private sector company, in other words, a supply chain. Then what responsible actors do, and I'm not saying the Russians are, but I'm saying that we would like to be, what you're then supposed to do is you cast the net very wide, you then only exploit the targets that are proportionate for you to exploit. And you do, and within that, and you don't disrupt those targets, you just, you get the information you need, and you close off accesses to the rest of them. Now, from what we know of the technical detail, that appears to have been what has been done in the SolarWinds case. In other words, they did have a large number, 18,000 or something potential targets, but the number of exploited targets was very, very much lower than that, and that they haven't exploited them. That is in contrast, for example, to the Microsoft Hafnium, apparently Chinese hack of a few weeks later. And I would commend a very interesting piece in Lawfare by Dmitry Alperovich and a colleague, which distinguishes between the two. So I'm not here to condone Russian state activity. I'm not here to dispute the Biden administration's response, because I think, and we'll come on to that, but I think its description of it is measured. I just think that in this particular case, words like act of war, or phrases like act of war, words like reckless, are not justified on this one. That does not mean to say that the response we've seen today from the US is not warranted.
Thank you, Ciaran. That's very useful. We'll come back to this, because this is a major theme. I think what you say. So if we condemn this, then we would also have to condemn our own actions, because many of us work on the same side of the line of legality. Talking about legality, maybe as we're still sort of in the setting the scene, Russell, could you perhaps comment on sort of the state of affairs when it comes to international law and these kind of operations? So cyber espionage, so we often hear espionage as such is not something that is regulated by international law in any sense, but it doesn't necessarily mean that international law has nothing to say about these kind of things. So could you tell us sort of where international law stands and how it relates to SolarWinds? Then we have the baseline for the conversation.
Yes, thank you, Dennis, and also thank you for the invitation. I mean, the answer to your question is really, it depends upon who you ask. If you ask one of the Five Eyes states or scholars from the Five Eyes states, I think they'd tell you that international law doesn't regulate espionage per se as a general matter. And the point to make here is it's not that espionage is lawful under international law, but the view is, the mainstream view is that, and to quote one scholar, is that international law and espionage are ships that pass in the night and never to meet. So the idea is that the practice of espionage and the regulatory discipline of international law never intersect. For me, this view has never been particularly convincing. And if you look beyond the practice of the Five Eyes states, and if you look beyond the scholarly writings of those working within the territory of the Five Eyes states, I think you'll find quite a lot of evidence to demonstrate that international law does actually regulate espionage. Now, it's not that international law creates very specific and direct rules on the topic of espionage, but these rules, there are rules of international law that do have an impact upon espionage and do apply to espionage to a certain extent. So there can be general principles of international law, such as principles of sovereignty, perhaps even a principle of intervention or non-intervention, and there could be specialized regimes. So I don't think anybody would seriously deny that espionage or even cyber espionage against a diplomatic mission or a consular post would be a violation of diplomatic and consular law. And also espionage can even implicate international human rights law, and particularly the right to privacy. So there is international law that applies to espionage. And in my own writings, I've tried to work really hard to put to bed the idea that these are two entities that never interact. International law does have something to say about this practice. And indeed, when this practice is cyber enabled. Yes, as I say, if you look to the practice of these states, and in particular the judgments of various international and national courts, you'll see that the jurisprudence of these courts have held that espionage is, in certain circumstances, a violation of international law, and in particular a violation of the principle of sovereignty. So in the physical context, the principle of sovereignty confers upon governments the right to determine who comes in and who leaves their territory. It's one of the fundamental basis of international law, and that would prevent one state from sending its spies into the physical territory of another state. So the question is, when espionage is cyber enabled, does the state that's committing cyber espionage, remote cyber espionage against the digital infrastructure of another state, violate that state's sovereignty? Does that act of cyber espionage trespass into a domain protected by the sovereignty of another state? So the question there is not whether or not the act is reckless or disproportionate or overt or covert or whatever it is. The issue is there a wrong to the personality of another sovereign state? So has there been trespass? Has there been intrusion? Has there been penetration into the sovereign authority of another state? Now, as I said, this can happen in a physical domain, of course. If you send it into the territory of another state, if you send a U-2 spy plane into the national airspace of another state, if you send a ship into the territorial seas of another state, then that will be a violation of the target state's sovereignty. What about in the context of cyberspace? I've long argued that digital penetration in and by itself would be a wrong to the target state's personality, regardless of the level of effects. And I think that's really one of the most pressing questions that international legal scholars, at least, have to grapple with. And as we move forward, and as cyberspace becomes more important, and as cyberspace becomes increasingly woven into the daily fabric of our everyday lives, and actually I think the COVID pandemic has shown how important cyberspace is to our daily lives, then I don't understand why a state's physical territory is deserving of more protection than a state's sovereign cyber infrastructure. I'll leave it there. I can see Ciaran gesticulating at me.
It looks like Ciaran begs to differ. So.
Oh, no, it's only to correct myself because information is coming in so fast. We need Ellen on. The Treasury statement does say reckless, and it's on the scope. And I think the early reaction from US academics, who of course are better placed than I am, both geographically and professionally, to put this in the context of US law and policy, They are seeing today's announcement, and obviously it's far too early to tell. It's only 10:30 in the morning in Washington, but they are seeing this as this is a significant break with how the US has traditionally viewed these matters. And the implications of that will take a lot of time to digest. So I think we're in discussion literally within an hour of the narrative changing quite significantly, certainly from Washington.
But yeah. So if I could just come in there very, very quickly. I mean, if I understand the technology correctly, the SolarWinds hack was actually very targeted, was very sophisticated. The operators of the hack were able to very carefully manage how the backdoor was constructed, when it could be accessed, and so on and so forth. So, is it reckless? Is it less reckless than the technology that powered the Snowden revelations and Prism and all those types of malware? So, I mean, my view would be actually that the SolarWinds hack was was more discriminate and less reckless than previous examples of cyber espionage. So I think the US is going to get itself into a whole host of problems there by going down the reckless route.
I'm not disagreeing. I'm just trying to reserve judgment until time to study the detail, because by that and some of the scholars that I'm thinking about are saying the same thing. This will raise significant questions about the US's own intelligence gathering posture.
Because this is interesting, right? We have three experts here who basically all say roughly the same. Say, okay, the net is cast very wide, but in terms of actually using the intrusion, it's actually fairly targeted, which in Ciaran's words is okay, it's pretty much what's been done before, but now we see apparently a kind of different reaction from the United States. We'll come to that in a bit, but there's one thing I would like to ask, sort of to put SolarWinds in perspective. So if you take sort of cyber espionage throughout the last decade, for example, I mean, do we see something that makes this extra worrying? Or if you zoom out and you take a slightly longer view, do we see different kinds of operations that merit different kinds of worries? I mean, is Moonlight Maze different from the OPM hack, different from SolarWinds? Is there anything to say about how this field basically develops through the operations that we actually can see, right? I mean, Ronald is right. I mean, the best operations are the ones we do not talk about because we don't know they're going on. Is there anything to say about this?
Shall I start off?
Sure.
I think what we see now is actually that the impact is bigger, and that is mostly because we are getting more and more digital. I think for the Dutch listeners, there was no cheese in our supermarkets last week because a very small firm had some ransomware. And 10 years ago, it wouldn't have mattered if their computers would fail. They still would know where to bring the cheese to. So I think in that sense, the world has changed. And it also has changed in that not only China, Russia, and Iran and North Korea are doing this hacking. Hacking is fairly easy, actually. And that's very different from how espionage worked before. In the human era, where we had to send people abroad, it was very hard to build a cover, to send them out, to make them safe. There was for one person to go into another country, there were like 100 working in their home country actually to support this one guy. That is not necessary anymore. And so there's much more actually there to get. And it's also right that once you're hacking, once you're inside systems, it's, and that's a point I think we will touch on later in this discussion as well. It's also very interesting to discuss from the agency who actually has access to another organization in another country. Yes, I can steal the information now, but I also see that, for instance, Putin is actually sending out tasking to do some interference in another country where elections are going on. Let's try to change that kind of the executive orders from Putin. It's it's always hard to if you know too many things, what really happened to come up with examples. So this is a very stupid example, but I think it gives away the idea that once you're inside, you're also able to manipulate much more easy. And this was in the old days very much different. So I think this is really changing. And also in the discussion, I think Ciaran mentioned the Snowden revelations against what we're seeing right now. It's also a discussion from passive SIGINT from the old days, where you actually are only able to eavesdrop information, which is very broad. You suck in all the data you can get your hands on, and then you try to filter out what is really relevant. In opposite from hacking, which is really much more targeted at the end, because you only want to spend resources on those organizations which are interesting. So for instance, in the SolarWinds, I think like 18,000 companies were actually have their doors open to Russia, but only a handful were actually being misused. Microsoft, one of them.
Ciaran, perhaps you would like to comment as well. So from your previous seat, not Blavatnik, but from your previous seat at the NCSC, when you sort of look back over the years, was this something where you thought, okay, the landscape is changing, we need to worry about different things, we need different kind of responses, we need different kind of defenses? How would you target in terms of espionage?
Well, I'll let the NCSC, it continues, I hope, to be a thriving organisation, so I'll let them speak for themselves. And I know they're part of the UK government's part of the formal attribution statement. And by the way, sorry, just because they are digesting this so fast, the US Department of the Treasury statement is really, really interesting. Scope and scale of this compromise, combined with Russia's history of carrying out reckless and disruptive operations, makes this a national security concern. The SVR has put at risk the global technology supply chain. I think that's the key sentence, because of tens of thousands of SolarWinds customers, and it lists a whole pile of sectors which were targeted. But of course, that will not, they were not exploited, but it doesn't say that. And it says that will cost businesses and consumers in the US millions of dollars to fully address. And they stole red team tools. I assume that's the FireEye reference, which mimic cyber attacks, etc., which, if made public, of course they haven't, or used offensively, which we don't know, would create additional opportunities. So that's the logic of the US's new position. So just thought it was worth reading that out.
Just a quick two-finger on that. Is that something, this statement, you say this is the Treasury Secretary, Treasury statement, right? Is that something that is also run by the Foreign Office, the NSA, or at least the National Coordinator for Security? How does that work?
Well, in the US, I mean, obviously I'm not an American, never worked in the government, but the US
You've met a few of them.
Yeah, but the US does play a great store in what they call the interagency process. Absolutely. The US is in fact, one of the reasons why US processes tend to be quite deliberative and take quite a while is because of this interagency process. So I'd be very surprised if that was if that major, and of course, given that this is, I wouldn't, whilst it may sound odd to say UK or EU ears as to this being from the Treasury, because obviously in the UK it wouldn't come from the Treasury, but the US Treasury is of course the Department for Sanctions in the US, and so it's that side of it. So I think that is the single authoritative considered statement of the US government. On the wider point that you mentioned, how would a government like the UK think about this? I think that whilst it is very difficult to counter things like supply chain hacks of this technical sophistication, I mean, that is the scope of a lot of work. So there are, I think, three things that are the lessons that are lessons from this, and I think the UK certainly comes out reasonably well out of one and unknowable out of the two others. So the first one is just the quality of critical parts of the technological supply, the quality of security in critical parts of the technological supply chain. Whilst the access is done by implanting SolarWinds, it was done in a very sophisticated way. It does ask questions about the defenses of critically important companies that supply important organizations. So that's the first thing. The second thing, though, is that if all organizations can, no organization can abdicate responsibility for its suppliers. You do. So for example, there are some literal readings of NCSC guidance on, supply chain dependency, which if completely rigorously implemented should, in theory, have detected the SolarWinds compromise. So in the early days of the SolarWinds hack, there was a lot of sort of commentary about how actually the organizations that had been lazy and deficient and hadn't updated their SolarWinds product got away with it, and the ones who were dutiful and acted appropriately did. It's not quite as simple as that, as my understanding. If you'd run the sort of proper tests and so forth, you might, as indeed FireEye eventually did. So that's the second thing. Then the third thing actually is just this whole thing about strategic supply chain management. I don't know this for sure, but I'm sure it came as a surprise to some important people in the Washington administration that a company that some of them probably hadn't heard of was such a critical single point of failure in, say, the federal government. I think you're always learning. So are there other, obviously everybody heard of Microsoft. So that's one sort of challenge, but, there are all sorts of different, little important components of the system. And, you look around a bit and say, well, are we too over dependent on this company because it makes it too much of a target? And if so, what do we do about it? Or B, if it is inevitable that we're going to be over dependent on a small number of companies, how do we come back to the first point? How do we have the highest standards out of them, even if that means, for example, paying a bit more? So I think the main reason, the main lesson, Dennis, I take out of all of this, which is the sort of thing I've been banging on about for years, is the West gains from safer technology. It's a net gain. A general safer standard of technology will make it harder for some of my former colleagues at GCHQ and others to gather intelligence abroad. But overall, open, highly sophisticated, highly digitized societies that are open, free, democratic, and based on the rule of law have more to lose by insecure technology than they have to gain by exploiting insecure technology. So, I think whilst today's discussion will understandably be skewed in favor of analysing the sort of geopolitical and doctrinal and international legal, as Russell has been pointing out, implications of the US's reaction to this, which is strikingly different from what has happened in the past, I do think that one of the longer term lessons is just we've got to get serious about fixing the standards of security and technology.
Yeah, because it is interesting. Perhaps Ronald can do a quick comment on that. But it's also something that in Ciaran's work was important, like you say. So one of the mantras has always been that to increase the general level of cybersecurity is make sure that people patch, make sure that people update, etc. And now you have a hack that is basically piggybacking on that exact idea to make a hole, basically. So that is probably not making the job of keeping companies and societies safe. So is this something where you say, okay, like you say, we gain if we have a better security overall? Is this something where you would say this is not something at least Western agencies should not do? Or how does that, because that's not how it works usually, right? If it's possible, it will get used. Ronald, would you care to comment?
Yeah, I'm not sure if you really understood it, but yes, well, to stop this happening, I think, of course, we can try to defend ourselves a little bit better in getting more secure networks. And of course, there's always examples where people were too sloppy with the patching, as you mentioned. And but in the real sophisticated attackers, like they have in China and Russia and in the Western countries as well, they always will be able to, either through a supply chain attack in combination with humans or using zero-day exploits, they will always be able to enter networks. And it's very hard to detect them. And they're also very good in blending in. It is actually what we saw within the SolarWinds as well, that all the network traffic you will see is actually from the outside just the same as what normal applications will also present in that network. So it's very hard actually, getting harder and harder to monitor in networks what's happening. So if we will, and that's getting about a bit outside of my world, is if you want to be more secure, it also we also need to go in different steps, like that it really means something, that if you got hacked seriously, that the attacker actually should be a bit scared if people find out. And that what we now see is that it looks like the attackers, they don't care that much. So some try to be, especially in the espionage field, they try to be very much under the radar, of course, otherwise their operation will stop. But you see a lot of other hackers just doing their thing, like we have huge Russian ransomware gangs, and they're not being stopped because just it's nobody's taking any action against them. And so I think, and I'm looking forward actually to find out what the US administration is actually going to do now. We need other steps to stop the attackers from attacking us, other than just defending ourselves in a technical way.
That's interesting. I want to take sort of a point that Ciaran made on sort of on his first quick reading. I'm not going to hold anyone to anything, but his first quick reading of the Treasury document, where he's saying, okay, this is different from your normal US reaction, and given interdependence, interagency, this may be carried widely within the administration, and maybe sort of combining that with the problem of hypocrisy that we also touched upon, right? So you call out different countries for doing these things, but many countries, especially Five Eyes, obviously do these operations themselves as well. So having heard sort of the language that is used in this Treasury department, so Russell, maybe you would like to comment. Is this, so Ciaran says, this is actually a bit of a departure from what we normally hear in this situation. How would you evaluate that? You have probably looked at many attribution statements. Is this language where you say, okay, this notes something differently?
Yeah, I mean, I think you used the right word there, hypocrisy. I mean, for me, the difference between, what we're seeing now and what we've seen before in relation to previous cyber espionage campaigns is, the identities of the participants involved, and in particular that the US is now the victim rather than the perpetrator of this activity. So of course, the US is looking to develop and implement a strong response to the hack, and in order to do so, of course, it needs to use international law. I mean, if it can't establish that Russia's acted unlawfully, then its responses are extremely limited. So it needs to be able to establish that there's been a violation of international law. Now, according to its own rationale, then that would be very difficult. So we see the US administration referring it to as more than espionage, advanced espionage, hyper espionage, an attack against the supply chain. I don't really know what that means. I mean, an attack against the supply chain, I mean, this is not a new thing. I mean, many former cyber espionage campaigns have targeted supply chains. I think it's an attempt to use language in order to shoehorn espionage into a new legal category that would enable the US to take a much more robust response than when it was the perpetrator of this type of activity itself. So, I'm not against espionage per se or cyber espionage per se. If states think that intelligence collection is an important part of statecraft, if they believe that it results in information sharing, that it reduces risks, that it exposes vulnerabilities and threats, then that's absolutely fine. But states need to create rules based upon principles, based upon open state practice, based upon proper dialogue between states. At the moment, around espionage, we have the opposite of that. And I think, as Ronald said, it's not just about the technological protection that can be provided. We need a multi-layered approach. So we also need a robust international legal framework, one that's based upon principles, one that's based upon values, rules that are mediated between the various actors within the international community. Perhaps the Biden administration being perhaps more open about this, perhaps trying to get their hands around exactly what's happened and trying to take a proper open response is the start of a more productive discourse around espionage and cyber espionage in an international legal setting. I hope so, because clearly the system we have at the moment is not working.
All right, I want to come back to that in a bit, but first I want to sort of combine something you said with something Ronald said. Ronald said, okay, what we miss is and so that there is no repercussions, basically. So attackers are not afraid. And then Russell sort of used, you said, okay, perhaps the Biden administration is, what were your words? I think you said, is trying to carve out something like a new legal category that they can maybe sort of tie consequences to. Could you in a few lines say, okay, what would be the outline of that new legal category? What do you think is the thing they're latching onto?
Well, yes, that's the problem, isn't it? I think recklessness would be a really important thing there. Because we're still talking about information collection. We're still talking about espionage. So how do you distinguish between acceptable and unacceptable espionage? Well, it seems to be, through this prism of recklessness. But what's reckless and what's not? I think that's a very slippery concept, and perhaps one that's not, that rules should be built on.
Okay, so recklessness or indiscriminate, that's also one you hear a lot in the debate. So those are maybe keywords that may play a role.
So can I just come in there? The problem there, Dennis, is that the SolarWinds hack wasn't indiscriminate. It wasn't reckless. It was much less reckless and more discriminate than what was happening around Snowden. So I think that exposes the problems there.
Ciaran, yeah, perhaps to you. Maybe we would like to, because Russell is also sort of alluding to the fact that at some point, if states have an inkling of an idea that there are things happening under the banner of cyber espionage, then that is something that states should be talking about amongst themselves, formulating clear principles of what is or isn't permissible. Is that something that you see happening? Is that something where you say, okay, maybe this is a point, whether SolarWinds is the good push-off point for that or not, doesn't really matter, but is this something that may start or not at all?
I'd be surprised. Given the very slow progress on more obvious issues of, the so-called cyber norms debate around critical infrastructure and so forth, given how slow that's all been, getting to the highly complicated and less physically destructive world of espionage, where, as I think, despite differing perspectives, I think there is a bit of consensus about, it's not the same thing as a disruptive attack, and targeted, that espionage can be useful. So, if the world can't sort out, norms about protecting people from harmful cyber attack, then getting to the nuances and niceties of espionage would seem even harder. And I don't think Western governments, particularly Five Eyes ones, are yet that interested in confronting some of. If you take the Microsoft view of the world, and which seem in part to be reflected in parts of the Biden statement, but I don't think they're. I don't think the conditions are yet there for the for that conversation. Having said all that, clearly we're digesting some surprise language from Washington, so who knows what will follow on the back of that. But I'd still be surprised. I think there are some areas where I would align with Russell, and some areas where I wouldn't go as far as him. I certainly would align with him on the immaturity of the framework of international legal understanding for cyber espionage, and in an ideal world there would be a more open discussion about that. Although I've just said I think it's unlikely, and I think there are interesting choices for it. And genuinely, I don't know whether I think it's one of those areas where constructive debate would be useful, because the knowledge gained by espionage can be can contribute to stability and reduce the risk of miscalculation without doing anybody any particular amount of harm. At the same time, the routine subversion of supply chains is something that needs to be weighed into consideration. And actually, it's countries caught in the middle of the great powers. The tale of crypto AG from the last century is absolutely fascinating, where US and West German, it's that far back, we're talking about West German intelligence, compromised one of the major suppliers of government sort of secret cryptography across the world. But the people who suffered detriment in terms of being vulnerable to espionage, they weren't the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China, because they were never going to buy a Swiss company's cryptography. They were going to build their own. It was Iran, it was the Latin American countries, and so forth. So that so I think it's interesting that. Where I wouldn't go as far as Russell, and is probably around. I'm not sure. Whilst I've said, I would say that there are aspects of the SolarWinds operation which are very similar to Snowden. And I already said I signed a quote statement that sounds remarkably like the sort of tradecraft used in SolarWinds. I'm not sure where the evidence would be that Snowden went beyond that. And similarly, so that's and similarly, in terms of hypocrisy and so forth, and very. That's quite a strong statement for, I know it was said in a specific context, but firstly, even though I find some aspects of the language coming out of Washington challenging in terms of my understanding, and I would concur with Russell on that, in the pre-digital age of traditional espionage, when a large Soviet spy ring was uncovered in Washington, or vice versa, there were consequences, even if everybody accepted it was part of acceptable state conduct. So there's nothing inherently wrong about taking an approach. And what I think, and you've got to bear in mind the political realities facing the Biden administration, they were coming in heated language in Congress and all the places about the severity of this, and on the back of a whole series of norm-shattering Russian activity going back to the 2016 election. And if you're looking, and we're all digesting this, but the language, there's some language which I think people are finding unconvincing, about why are you choosing to sanction this? And they're saying that apparently the administration officials in briefings are saying it was the scale and scope, the burden falling largely on the private sector, which isn't that convincing because the Microsoft half name is probably a bigger burden on the private sector, and the possibility of damage, the speed at which an actor can move from espionage to degradation is the blink of an eye. And again, that's the sort of thing that we are used to in Western espionage. We just what they do by then, if you look at some of the wider documentation, what they're doing by conflating it with other Russian attacks, and they begin to use the SVR and the FSB interchangeably. The same, and this comes on the back of, and then they list all these FSB norm-busting things. And so what it seems to me is that actually the Biden administration has actually lost patience with lots of malevolent Russian activity cumulatively over a period of time, is under pressure to do something about it. There is concern about SolarWinds. You can argue that SolarWinds wasn't the right one to get agitated about. There were plenty of other choices, mostly FSB rather than SVR, and they've got agitated about this one. And when you put it in that context, you can sort of see what the political drivers are, which lead you to a set of outcomes that may not make perfect logical sense in the specific context of SolarWinds, but taking the longer view of the last 4 or 5 years of malevolent Russian cyber activity might seem to some to be at least justified. So I can see, there's a lot of rigor in the arguments that have been put forward against it by Russell, by including myself and others. I think the oracle of what's in it has just joined us, so we should hand over to her, and I might have to go in about myself, Dennis. So
yes,
So I'll be quiet now.
No, don't.
Hi, Ciaran. Great to see you. And Dennis.
Hi, Ellen. Thank you for sparing.
Welcome, Ellen. Ellen is jumping in on the name Corianne Oosterbaan to get her in quickly, and she will probably have to leave quickly too. Yeah. It's a busy day out there in DC. But we'd love to get some hot takes on what you think is going on. Ciaran sort of scanned the Treasury statement and said, okay, this is in language in terms of using reckless and things like that. So we were sort of debating on, so how different is this reaction, arguably not just against SolarWinds, but a number of things together. How different is this from previous reactions to cyber incidents? But maybe you could just take us to a snapshot of your day.
Yeah, this story started to break yesterday, and we have been updating it as we go along. I mean, the official announcement came out just a few hours ago from the White House. And so as you've all seen, the Biden administration is imposing it's the first significant economic sanctions in a few years on Russia over SolarWinds, yes, but also the influence efforts from last year's 2020 election. And then they are messaging along with that, though they're not explicitly linking the sanctions to these actions, they're messaging other activities like Russia's reported effort to put bounties on the heads of US soldiers and coalition troops in Afghanistan in 2019, poisoning of Navalny, things like that. This is the first, I guess what the Biden administration is trying to do is send a more holistic message that the US government wants to be firm and resolute in standing against a series of malign actions by Russia, not just specifically cyber. And they're trying to do this calibrated approach where they both want to sort of seem or be firm, but also leave the door open to diplomacy, because at the same time, Biden is saying to Putin, I propose a summit, later this summer in a European capital, so we can continue to discuss the relationship. He's trying to hold the door open to continued or improved relations. They used the phrase tailored and proportionate in this background call this morning, just to describe the sorts of actions they're taking. They differ from, obviously, from the Trump administration, in the sense that they are actually taking a more significant line against Russia and these Russian activities, and doing it fairly swiftly, although some would argue that they should have acted sooner, since this is 4 months since the SolarWinds activity was disclosed. And they're acting more resolutely than the Obama administration as well, which was a kind of reluctant to say anything in the summer of 2016, even though they knew that Russia was trying to interfere in the presidential election. They kind of waited till October to actually make a first statement. And they were also reluctant to sort of take actions without buy-in from European allies. So I think the Biden administration is being more aggressive and assertive here with respect to Russia, but at the same time, they don't want to be too escalatory. Sort of my take on that.
Thanks. And if you would zoom in sort of on the more cyber elements of it, is there anything specific about the language where you say, okay, this is different from before? Because you say they sort of packaged it all together, so it becomes more like a foreign policy statement.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, they did.
And specific incidents. So what was that?
There was messaging around the nature of the SolarWinds attack or incident. They've officially pinned the blame on the SVR today in an official statement. Something we'd already known, but the government had never officially said it. They're calling this, they're saying, yes, it was espionage, but it was, the way they're describing it, broad in scale, potentially affecting 16,000 or 18,000 entities, in the US and Europe. And as the White House has been saying all along, that gave the Russians a potential toehold into networks where they could use their access to move from espionage to disruption. And as Ciaran, knows, he and I have talked about this. The SVR doesn't engage in that type of activity. They're known much more for doing classic political espionage, and it doesn't seem that this operation was intended to be disruptive. In fact, they had a sort of a kill switch built in, so that they picked and chose their targets carefully with discrimination. And if they weren't interested in a particular target, they sent out basically some malware to disable the malware so that it wouldn't, so that there wouldn't be further compromises. So in that sense, one could argue that the SVR operation was actually more discriminating than a totally indiscriminate campaign. Nonetheless, the White House is viewing this operation as broad and indiscriminate and potentially disruptive, and also has putting the burden on primarily in the private sector to do the mitigation, which is costly, and for those reasons they feel deserving of sanction, of punishment.
It's really interesting because I want to pick up on the point of the indiscriminate, because you're joining the choir here in the sense that all other three panelists have basically said the same thing. So it's SVR, it's targeted, it is not actually a very wide-ranging, and yet there is this political condemnation of specifically this cyber operation as being indiscriminate, wide-ranging, reckless, etc. So I think that's an interesting takeaway from this.
Right. I mean, but I'll also note that former top intelligence officials like John Brennan, the former CIA director, has said, he's told me, but don't forget, espionage is illegal in the United States. If we catch spies, we can charge them, we can expel them, and we have. In fact, they're expelling 10 spies who have diplomatic cover here in the U.S. So it's not unprecedented or unheard of to punish people for spying. It's kind of like, just don't get caught. It's sort of the unspoken rule, right? I guess one of the questions is whether this is proportionate or disproportionate, and the administration is arguing that their actions today are proportionate, and that I guess you all could discuss and debate whether or not. I mean, these sovereign debt sanctions are more impactful than just sanctioning GRU and SVR officers or PNGing them. But they are not the nuclear option. They could be stronger still. They could sanction all sovereign debt, not just future issuances. They could do secondary markets, not just primary markets. They could also escalate sanctions to state-owned banks and energy companies and defense companies, put them on the designation list and put full blocking sanctions on them. That would really squeeze the economy, but could also have spillover effects, especially in Europe.
So a more assertive response, but still restrained in terms to what the possibilities could be. I want to ask the other panelists if they have something to ask of you, but also I have a question, Isabella.
All right, because I then have to leave, sorry.
Yeah, no, I know. This is why
I have to leave, unfortunately, as my prediction has come to pass. So thank you, and Ellen, thank you for that fascinating update, and I look forward to reading your copy tomorrow or later today.
Ciaran, do you have a parting shot for Ellen?
Listen to anything else Ellen can say, because she's the best informed person in the world in these matters. That's free to speak.
All right, that's close.
Look forward to joining you again.
Thank you, Ciaran.
Thank you so much, everyone. Okay, bye-bye.
It's been an interesting, lively debate, and very close. I don't often have debates where people are reading through statement as they come out in a debate. So that's very good. Thank you all for participating, and thank you all for thinking on your feet and being prepared to take a stand. Thank you for the participants. Very nice of you to join us. I hope you enjoyed this. I bid you all a good evening, and hope to see you on another occasion. Thank you very much.